In this episode, we're going to be talking about the story of ethics and how morality comes to exist, how morality can be both objective and subjective and operate in both of those spaces. And we're going to take it all the way back to the biology of the human, a little bit of neuroscience to help back it up, and then ultimately give an answer as to like what we should do about morality, how we should behave in society, and why. And so if you are at all interested in human behavior, why it is that we do what we do, how to look out for immoral behavior, and how to judge bad behavior, then this video is for you. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'll see you on the other side of the intro.
Since the first spark of human thought, no pursuit has shaped our journey more deeply or elevated each new generation of man to new heights than the eternal pursuit of truth. From ancient wisdom to spiritual enlightenment and technological advancement, we've crafted cultures and communities to give our species its best chance to survive. Truth and justice stand eternal as humanity's compass. In this age of transformation, let their guardians rise anew.
All right, so to understand this problem, we have to do a little thought experiment first. The first thing we need to do is we need to look at humanity from the idea of the individual. So in modern times, it's hard to think about the world in terms of the individual, especially in like Western culture, because we live in such massive communities that everything gets very confusing very quickly, and we start adopting ideologies as a result of that are horrible for society. And that's because it's extremely hard for our brains to do the math and figure out like what it is we're supposed to be doing. And so we're going to address how that happens. We're going to address that closer to the end, and not in great detail in this video because this video is about morality and ethics. But in order to like remove all the noise from the conversation, the first thing we have to do is we have to remove all the other people from the idea. And that comes down to us, right? And so we're a single person, we're a single unit. And ultimately civilization, when you take it back far enough, starts with a single unit. It doesn't matter if you believe in creationism or evolution. Ultimately, when you separate out the causes, okay, you get a single person. And whenever you think about the problem in terms of how you should behave, it still comes down to just a single person. And so whether you want to think about it in modern times or in historic times and kind of how this all happens, it's all going to start here. So let's look at the human, the individual. But let's go all the way back to like the caveman days, right? We'll say like this is the caveman era. Right, and this is Bob, except Bob doesn't actually have a name because Bob doesn't speak English yet or language at all. And then over here we have John. And so Bob is living his life alone, and Bob's doesn't live in a society, a civilization. Bob doesn't go to the store to get his food. Bob lives his day completely alone. Without technology, there's no refrigerator to store food. Everything goes bad very quickly. And so Bob is primarily focused on Bob's survival. And so he is living in the old days where life is hard and everything has to be done to survive on a daily basis. And so Bob goes out and Bob hunts and he picks berries, and he brings those that food back to his tribe. It's not really his tribe, but his home, and he tries to save as much food as he can. But every day or every couple days, Bob has to go out. He has to collect food and or resources, and he has to bring them back. And that might be, some water. Like really, there's not a lot of ways to store water. So if he needs something to drink, he's got to live near a water source. If he's got to go out daily and get food, that's consuming a lot of his time and attention. And so one day Bob can do this on a daily basis, and it provides him purpose and meaning. So Bob is an animal, and Bob has, like every other cellular organism, Bob has survival instincts, meaning that his brain, his primitive brain, is telling him like, hey, you know what? We don't have a lot of time. We need to go get food. We're going to be hungry and thirsty in a few hours. And so we have to repeat this cycle. And his executive brain is telling him, hey, this is how we do this thing. It's doing math. And it's saying, hey, this is how we survive, is we go, we collect food, we get water, and then we bring our food back, and we start storing up as much as we can. And then one day Bob hits puberty, and Bob goes like, oh, this is an interesting feeling. And then Bob happens to run into Sarah. And Sarah is the most beautiful thing Bob has ever seen. And so Bob decides that he is going to try and hook up with Sarah, and Sarah turns out she likes him. And so Bob and Sarah form a little family. And so now Bob has him and his spouse or partner, and they can do this more effectively. But as it turns out, when you're an animal and you have sex drive, then you want to reproduce. And so Bob and Sarah, they get it on like the mammals they are. And then suddenly Sarah is pregnant, and Bob has to continue to provide for Sarah because she's becoming less able to do so herself. Also, she's more vulnerable. And Bob, being an animal, has an imperative to protect and provide for his offspring, right? Offspring. This is like Bobby, right? A little Bobby inside there. And his wife, who's preparing to have a child. And then she's going to have to help nurture and raise that child. So Bob now faces a dilemma. Bob has to go out into the wilderness, and he has to continue to gather resources. But what's left back here at home is a little bit more valuable than just the seeds and berries that he had stored. Now Bob has to protect and provide for Sarah and little Bobby. So what is it that Bob is going to do? Every time he leaves, he starts feeling insecure, right? A little scared that, Sarah and the baby are not able to fend for themselves in the way that he could. Can't fight off, the big bear, right? So got our big bear. It's a big mean bear, and it's got big claws, and it does horrible things to humans when it finds them, right? Because it's a bear, and it likes to eat, and that's fine. There's a bear with big fangs. Roar. Okay, so Bob leaves his wife and future baby at home, and a bear comes and attacks the camp. And so luckily Sarah gets away, and Bob realizes, shoot, I have to now when I think about going out to get food, I'm super scared, because what if a bear comes and tries to kill my wife and my child? And so Bob's like has to think about it, right? He's using the executive part of his brain. One day, Bob he's got to go out, he's got to get food, and Bob happens to see, I don't know what we named him, John. And John also, right, has Amanda, and Amanda's over here, and they've got little Johnny, right there, and there's his one tooth. And John and little Johnny and Sarah have their own camp, and John is facing the same problem, right? John has to go out, and he's got to get food, and he's got to get resources, bring the water back for the family. And he's facing the same problem because, Mr. Bear also found out that they live there. And so the question becomes, how is it that these two individuals who, may not even speak the same language, may not have any language, begin to form communities? And the answer is, well, maybe the first time they don't, and maybe the first 1,000 times they don't. Maybe they fight to the death time and time again until eventually the executive part of their brain evolves to do the math, and one says, hey, you know what, maybe when I do the math and think about survival as my core function, it actually makes more sense to talk to this guy or signal or express that, we can work together. Why? Because when we work together, we'll say nice little handshake right here. When we work together, then we have what's called a force multiplier. This is called math. Okay, so this is subconscious math. This is what your brain does. There's neuroscience to back it up if you want to go find the studies and how that works. But ultimately, we have what's called a force multiplier. So when John and Bob come together and they figure out that mathematically it makes sense if they put their powers or combine their powers, right, or work with their powers combined, then they can achieve their goal better, because now, right, we have, I don't remember what her name was, but we'll say Jane just for this sake. Okay, so now we say, okay, well, Jane, actually, Bob and Jane are going to move over, and we're going to live in a tribe, right? We're going to live in a tribe with Sarah and Jane. So now everyone's happy and they're living together, and John and Bob are taking turns going out and getting food, or maybe they're going together but for a shorter period of time because they're able to accomplish more together. If they have to fight the bear, now it's 2-on-1, right? Now it's 2-on-1 instead of, two men on one bear versus just Jane or just Sarah and little Johnny getting eaten, right? And so their chances of survival increase. That is how the brain does, the executive mind does the math and figures out that it is better for us to do things together than it is to do them alone. And you can, again, look up the studies. You can find this stuff. This isn't, it's like Dawkins' selfish gene. There's all sorts of research and theories and understanding survival instincts and how cellular organisms self-organize around survival. Okay, and humans, turns out, are just organisms that are using psychology to as one form of self-organizing around survival. And so civilization will always happen. This will always happen. do this iteration a million times, and then it will happen some percentage or high percentage of the time. So the question is this: if Bob and John and Sarah and Jane get together and now they live near each other, and so now they're sharing resources, time, energy, effort, and they live in close proximity, and they each are sacrificing a little bit so that everyone has enough, then how is it that this mechanism stays intact? Well, we know that the neuroscience, right? We know that the brain is doing the math and figuring out that we're better together, right? You've seen it in all sorts of movies, stories. You've heard sayings. You see altruistic acts and behaviors. And ultimately, it's because the brain is telling us that, hey, you have a greater chance of survival when you do this together. So what we can infer from this reality is that if it becomes less likely that you will survive, then we're going to have a problem. Okay, so Bob, who is operating on his core functions, which is, I'm going to go out and survive, and he's got his sex drive and his hunger drive, and he's like, oh, and then we made a baby. This baby then becomes a function of his survival, and Jane becomes a function of his survival. So one, she is the mechanism by which he can produce children, and he is the mechanism by which she can produce children. She's having the same thoughts, same ideas, and consciously or subconsciously. And then little Bobby is now, and we're just going to say Bobby's born now. Okay, so Bobby becomes what it means to survive for Bob. Okay, and Bob needs Jane to help ensure that little Bobby survives. So Bob has these resources that he's built up in his life that the brain is continuously telling him he needs for survival, because ultimately, as we all know, Bob is going to die someday, right? That clock is ticking. So Bob has little Bobby, and John has little Johnny, and they're all happy living together, and their chances of survival have increased. And now we go, okay, well, what's the issue? Why should one be controlling the other's behavior? Why should one not do what they want? Obviously, they can leave anytime they want. They can leave anytime they want. But the problem is that they don't. And there's a reason for that. And it's important that we understand that the reason for that is because DNA and cellular organisms are imperfect systems, and they die. And their core imperative is going to be to reproduce so that the gene pool can live on. So there is an unconscious or subconscious mechanism that's driving behavior here, that is the root of what we build meaning on top of. And so it becomes imperative to Bob and to John that they maintain this family unit. Okay, this is what they have. And they go expend time, energy, and effort on a daily basis in order to ensure that this unit sustains life. Now, this is, you could call this like micro, and then you could also look at it in the macro and show that while they might be individually thinking about, or not consciously, but be driven by the imperative in their DNA that says, hey, we need to reproduce so that our DNA doesn't die. We can also look at this in a bigger picture, which is all of humanity doing the same thing. So just a little side note. So where do ethics come into this equation? Well, ethics are the how and why we should behave a certain way. The rules, right? The things that we should and should not do, can and cannot do, represented in the form of laws, represented in the form of justice, represented in the form of morality. We use all these different words to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. And, some of the greatest minds in the world haven't been able to solve the philosophy of ethics. Why is it that we should or should not do these certain things? Well, here's why. So what happens when Bob and John decide that they're going to live in close proximity to one another? Bob and John are both animals, and Jane and Sarah are also both animals. But Bob and John have a natural sex drive that happens all of the time. And it happens multiple times a day. And when John gets in close proximity to Jane, John goes, hey, Jane actually looks pretty attractive. Man, she is really pretty, and my wife is not sleeping with me because she's busy taking care of little Johnny, or maybe she's just out and about. Maybe John doesn't really understand why John shouldn't be able to do whatever John wants to do. And so John goes over and talks to Jane, and he persuades Jane. Jane thinks he's cute, and so John sleeps with Jane. Or maybe John rapes Jane because John is an animal, and he hasn't quite built, him and Bob and the ladies haven't built the social structures yet to explain why Bob and John shouldn't rape each other's wives. All they know is that this part of their brain is telling this part of their body that it's time to reproduce, and they don't understand why they should refrain from certain primal urges in order to sustain what's going on here. And so what happens is now John rapes Jane. Maybe John kills little Bobby because maybe little Bobby made little Johnny cry. And Bob, now when Bob's brain does the math, again, in that iteration, it goes, okay, living in proximity with these people is no longer beneficial for my survival. It's no longer a greater benefit to my survival than it was living alone, because now John has become a threat to my survival and what it means to survive. And you say, well, how do we quantify all that? Well, luckily it's not just me in the world having these thoughts. There are scientists out doing all sorts of observations, sociologists, psychologists, neuroscientists, and we know how the brain works, and we know how emotional appraisals work and prediction modeling works, and we know how the physiology of the human being works, and we understand how the DNA seems to have this encoding, this imperative to survive, because reproduction becomes the meaning by which the mass majority of humanity thrives. And so all of these things become reality. And when these two dudes got together, they didn't say, hey, John, yeah, Bob, look, man, we're going to move in and we're going to move closer together. And here's the thing, I want to lay out all these agreements with you. I want to cover all these details and make sure that you understand that Like, you can't have sex with my wife, and you can't hurt my kids. And we're both going to go out every day, and we're going to sacrifice our time and energy and effort to make sure that the community, right? The community, all of us, have more than enough, and we can thrive. And so they don't talk about this because they don't even have language at this time. They don't even have a way of thinking about these problems. They're mostly just trying to overcome their primal urges, and luckily their brains do the math whether they want them to or not, because they are not even consciously aware of what is going on at this point. And so this is where we get to what it means to be moral, because what we're talking about here is we're talking about something called a moral agent. And a moral agent is a being that has the capacity to enter into agreements that are outside of their, we'll say, like, their biological impulses. So they can resist their biological impulses, and they have the ability to enter into agreements with other moral agents in how things, you should say, ought to be or should be. Okay, so it is a heightened level of what's called agency, and that leaves us with the idea that now we can have a discussion on what's actually going on with Bob and John. So when Bob and John got together, they did not explicitly say anything about what they thought they should do. They just, their brains subconsciously did the math, and maybe it became in their conscious awareness. Maybe it came into their conscious awareness at some point as they began to see the benefits of what it was that they were doing. As little Johnny and little Bobby were crying less, and Jane and Sarah were less pissed off because they had more resources, and they weren't as scared because Bob and John actually killed the bear. Right? They killed the bear. Let's say bear's dead. Okay. And now they're like, oh man, so good. We have figured out how it is that this makes sense for both of us. Now, they're not saying these things explicitly. It's called implicit. And what happens in morality, and the way that we can understand how objective morality works, is that both of these individuals, consciously or subconsciously, are fighting for survival. And the way that they've come to understand how to survive better is that they're going to work together towards that common goal of survival. Okay? And what happens when they do this thing is they enter into what's called an implicit agreement. Okay, implicit means that it's not said out loud, it's not stated, it's not written down. It means it's implied. Okay, lots of things that we do in the world are unspoken. No one says, hey, you should help that lady up and help her, or help that old lady across the street, or hey, you should stop that bad guy. The culture might, the zeitgeist might. Maybe someone was raised with that value. But when we're talking in caveman times, there is no language, there is no contract, there are no values. There's just what's necessary for survival. And this is where we have to go if we want to understand how morality works. Because what happened when they came together is they entered into that implicit agreement. Okay, implicit agreement. Some people call something like this a social contract. Okay, except the problem is that you are not born with a pen in hand or the ability to sign anything. So it's really not a contract. It's an agreement, and it's really not spoken, so it is implicit. So they formed a level of trust. Okay. Trust meaning that they feel that they can reasonably assume that John and Sarah are going to act in the best interest of Bob and Jane's survival. Now, some maybe like biologists, neuroscientists, mathematicians might say, well, statistically, that was a really bad assumption, but it works. It works for some reason. The math that the brain does is better than what's in our conscious awareness, and they take their chances together. And if you ask a psychologist, he would say, well, it's because they look the same. They look like each other. They're more like each other than they are like the bear, right? So that is one of the mechanisms that we can use to understand why it is that this happens in the first place, is because all of the environment really is intended for this to happen. Again, self-organizing systems, this is always going to happen. It's going to happen every single opportunity you give it. It may take multiple iterations of life, but it will always happen, given the environment and given the brain and the way the human brain works. You see it in other animals too. It's not just humans. Other animals form tribes and they live under sets of rules and hierarchies. And inside what's going on there is an implicit agreement. And if you break the rules or break the hierarchy, then there are consequences. So we have plenty of evidence to understand how and why this implicit agreement or social contract is true. Okay, and so then the question becomes, what is this agreement? What is this guiding thing that is telling us what we should and shouldn't do? Well, let's look back at the neuroscience and the math and say, what is the brain trying to do? Well, again, this little executive mind up here is trying to calculate what the best path forward is. And while it's doing that, and it's trying to operate in this side of this new context, it's always doing its assessment. And so now we can say, well, what is the agreement? Well, the agreement is this: as long as this maintains or sustains the math to show that living together is better for our immediate survival of this family unit than it is to live apart, then they will continue doing it. But as soon as that math changes, then this little web of trust that goes from this family unit to this one, okay, then it breaks. Okay, it's gone. And so we just like that. So the agreement is that, hey, again, implicit, not spoken, but let's make it explicit. The agreement is, hey, Bob, I will move my family over into near your family, and we can do this work together for the benefit of our families, so long as you don't take from me and leave me less than whole. And Bob says, I can agree to that, just so long as, John, you don't take from me and leave me less than whole without my consent. Don't come over and take from my pile of berries. Don't come over and harm my child. Don't come over and sleep with my wife or rape my wife. This is what it means for me to survive. And this is what it means for me to survive. And when you take from me and you leave me less than whole, then the math, right? The math, right, goes bad. And now Bob says, I'm less than whole. This is bad for my survival. Bob has an amygdala hijack episode, and he goes over and he kills John. And now the cycle starts over. Or Bob and John fight. John kills Jane and little Bobby. And now Bob has to live in modern times, we could say, under the law, he can't go kill John. So Bob is now living less than whole. But Bob is not even consciously aware that this is what's going on because it's an implicit agreement. And so this is where morality comes in. Morality says that if you're operating under this agreement, meaning if you're benefiting from other people, then living in close proximity and operating inside of community, then you don't do things that take from others and leave them less than whole. You do not mess with this unit or whatever it means for them to survive. Because when you do that, you are breaking the agreement. And the thing about the agreement is that the agreement is what forms the web of trust. Very, very thinly veiled web of trust. And when we understand that Bob and John are just a representation of a whole bunch of people, okay, and now they're all living in community together, then we can understand that this is the web of trust. Okay. Boom. And we're just going to connect all of these. And with every new family that joins the community, every new child that's born is the next generation. Okay, they are building bonds and they are connected. And because of all of these people, they are increasing their chances of survival and thriving. Okay, or we could also label this survival and continuity. Continuity of the family, continuity of the self, continuity of the species. Okay, and so this is the web of trust. And what happens is when one person, okay, so this is how we get to the idea of justice, communal justice. This is how we get to the idea of morality and telling people how they should act and punishing them for not acting the right way, or and I like to say it as rehabilitating them and teaching them that it is bad. Unfortunately, we suck at that and don't tell people why it's bad. And so that's the purpose here, is to help everybody understand that the reason that you need to act morally and not harm others or take from them or steal from them is because as soon as one person breaks this web of trust and leaves them less than whole, okay, we're going to kill off Jane. Now Bob is angry. And Bob feels like he doesn't want to do this little thing anymore, and Bob no longer agrees. Okay, Bob no longer agrees with the implicit agreement. Okay, so we're going to say he does not agree any longer because he's been left less than whole, and the entire purpose of this whole thing was to help him survive and thrive. And John came over and killed Jane, and now it's just him and little Bobby, and now it's harder for him to survive than it was before. And so Bob has to do something to restore his wholeness. But the problem is that Jane's dead. So John can't, there's no way that John can ever do anything that would restore Bob's wholeness because Jane's dead. And he also couldn't do anything to restore Jane's wholeness because he killed Jane. And so But now what happens socially, in fact, let's just make it a little less extreme. Okay, so let's keep Jane alive. And let's say, maybe that's a little extreme, okay? Because there are some other, that can complicate things. So let's say that John comes over and he steals some of Bob's family's food. And now it's like, oh man, look at all this wonderful food. I was a little short on food. And so now, I came over and I took Bob's, and now Bob has less food. And Bob goes, wait a minute, I can't feed little Bobby, or maybe I can't eat because now there's not enough food for me because John took it and he left me less than whole. He left me less than where I was, and he's broken this agreement. So what does Bob have to do? Well, Bob has to feed his family because, again, this is the unit. And his brain's telling him, do the math, Bob. Do the math and do what's best for your survival. And it's no longer, right? No longer to engage this web of trust because John broke it. So Bob goes, well, what do I do? Well, now Bob has to go over here and he's going to have to steal some of this family's berries. He can't do it over here because these are gone because they were short. And now he's going to come over here and steal these berries. And now this family, this is Steve. Okay, this is Steve and Sally. So Bob comes over and steals some of Steve's and Sally's food. And now he's broken the web of trust here. Okay, and then Steve goes and does it again, and then they go and do it, and then they go and do it, and then they go and steal here, and then now everyone's broken trust. Okay, because everybody comes to the same conclusion when their brain does the math that they no longer agree that living in community with other people is what is best, is the best path forward, is mathematically or statistically going to give them a better chance of survival. And now these become tribes or individual family units, and they are all at war with each other. And what likely happens is, they become tribe A, right? And then they become tribe B. And now we've got war. All because we left the agreement implicit. And nobody understood what was going on or why they should behave the way they should behave. So let's do this real quick. Let's cover a little bit about what is going on in terms of why they should behave, or what it means to behave. So what it means, and you might have heard this called different things. There's something called Stoicism. This is one version. There's other versions, but ultimately what it means to build this web of trust is that you are saying that I will, through this agreement, exhibit enough discipline. Okay, discipline is the key word. Over my animal instincts, my desires, to the extent that I don't just take what I want when I want it. I don't just do what I want when I want to do it. Because as soon as John saw this pretty girl Jane, he might have wanted to sleep with her. As soon as he saw his little child hungry, he may have wanted to steal Bob's food because he was having fear, or he was feeling insecure. Or maybe Sarah was feeling insecure. Sarah was sad. And she said, John, you better do something. You better feed our little baby or else. Right? And John's like, oh man, I feel the pressure and I got to go provide. And so John does something stupid because his IQ is like -20 because or negative 20 points of where it was, because John is under an immense amount of stress and social pressure, and he went ahead and did that thing. Okay. So that is how the implicit agreement works. That is how discipline is the mechanism through which we are able to maintain this web of trust, because we exhibit we exhibit discipline, and we don't act upon our desires to the extent that we're not taking from other people, so that we can sustain community. Because community does the math, or when our brain does the math, community is the math, or is the best path forward. And so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense in terms of how it is that we form initially what we can call the implicit agreement in the web of trust. And then beyond that, let's just assume for a minute, let's just play this thought experiment out, that everybody does what they're supposed to do, and they don't steal from each other, and they work together, and they all equally sacrifice so that the whole of the community does better. And let's say that, John is just a little bit more efficient than Bob. And John goes and he collects a little bit extra of something, or maybe he does something different. Maybe Bob's the farmer and John is the blacksmith, and they enter into an agreement, an explicit agreement, a handshake agreement. And they say, hey, we're going to do this trade. We're going to do this barter. You need a scythe for your farming, and I need some grain for my meals or animals or whatever. And they make this explicit agreement. Now, what becomes moral, again, based on the foundation of the implicit agreement, right? We have to understand that the implicit agreement never goes away. Okay. Based on the foundation of the implicit agreement, right? Implicit agreement. Okay. They make an explicit agreement. And this new explicit agreement is built on top of the implicit agreement. And this is important to understand, because explicit agreement has to maintain the implicit agreement with it, and it has to sustain the web of trust, because Bob and John can't do something that puts, or shouldn't do something that puts the rest of the community in harm's way, one. And two, them saying that they will do this thing that they're decided to do, which is trade some grain for a scythe, for some blacksmithing, says, don't take from me and leave me less than whole without my consent. So explicit agreements are built on top of the implicit agreement. So everything comes down to the implicit agreement, which is built on top of the brain doing the math and saying, you could say survival instincts. I call it the primal imperative, okay, which is to survive. So, but we're just going to call it survival instincts for the sake of this video. Okay. And so what happens is, let's say that John and Bob, they do something and that violates the agreement, right? Let's say that they do something and it harms the community. Like, let's say, for example, they're like Enron, or they're like some corporation, or maybe they're a set of thieves, or, maybe they're a gang, or maybe they do something together and it harms community. then what happens is, okay, these two people have done something to harm community, and now Steve's like, whoa, okay, I don't agree with that, and I've decided that we no longer agree. And so now this is where we get to the point where we can understand how crime, loss of hope, homelessness, and a lot of behaviors, especially a lot of like socially harmful behaviors, become acceptable because, one, Steve's not even aware of what's going on. He doesn't consciously know. He's just like, I'm so mad, right? I'm so mad. And so then he goes and he's like, we're going to leave, right? So he leaves with his family, and now it's just down to the two. So Steve has to go off on his own, or maybe like Steve's like, oh, screw you guys, and he kills both of them. Well, the question becomes like, well, is that moral? And it's like, well, here's the question, right? Survival instincts. They did something to harm him. Okay, they broke the agreement. So Steve said, hey, you broke the agreement, so there's no agreement. And now that there's no agreement, what's best for me is to make sure that you can never harm me again. And so I'm going to kill you. And so he does. And now Jane and Bob and Sarah and John are gone. Okay. And so you might ask yourself, well, this is one way that we can understand how morality works. And if we think about humanity in the sense of the species, then we can say, well, that's bad for the species, one. And two, right, what Jane and John did, or sorry, Bob and John did, was also bad for the species. And so this may or may not be immoral, right? We could, there's maybe some argument there. Definitely this is, and definitely this is a rule, or like the way that we can judge morality. But what we can't really do is we can't say, well, what if John and Bob were doing something and Steve just felt left out? And then Steve just like told the story to himself, right? He's like, oh, I don't know what's going on, question mark, question mark. They could be plotting against me because he's feeling insecure. And he's got this little unit, that he's like, oh, I'm over here agreeing. All right, I'm over here agreeing. I'm over here doing my part, but they've left me out now. And so I feel insecure. And so what if he perceives something's going on, but nothing bad is going on? And then he decides to take action, and he decides to kill them anyway. Well, those are the types of things that we want to avoid, because that would be subjective, right? Subjective judgment of the situation, because he is not aware. And so what happens is we go, okay, well, we can't allow people to live in community, because as long as this is happening, we need a way to mediate these problems, right? And the way that we mediate these problems is we form an institution. Okay, so now it's no longer just this small tribe of people operating on an implicit agreement. Now we're trying to express that agreement explicitly, and the way that we do that is we get a judge. Okay, this judge has big ears, and he's got a big beard. All right. And here's our judge, and he's got like one hair because he's old. And then here's his robe. Okay. And this judge now is going to be, hopefully, right, objective. And he's going to try and mediate between these people and say, look, Bob, John, you shouldn't have taken from Steve, because, we're all trying to do our best here, and we've finally like written down, right, stealing's bad, right? Here's the law. Guys, the law is like, we're trying our best to understand this agreement, but, we're still pretty primitive. So we're like, don't steal, right? We don't know how to explain morality through the lens of survival because we just haven't achieved that level of understanding yet. And so we're like, don't steal, don't kill, don't rape, don't pillage, right? They're like, hey, we can all agree to these things. And so, they all sign it and they're like, yeah, we won't do this, guys. We agree that this is all bad stuff. And so this guy represents what's called an institution. Okay. And now the institution becomes the explicit version of what we're calling morality. And so the problem, like, hopefully you're following along, but, if not, like, up to this point, we've got the implicit, survival instincts, brain does the math. We've been operating on the implicit agreement. Some bad things happened. We figured out, hey, it's best if we have a judge and a mediator. And so, judge, mediator, right? Some third party, some written version of this thing that says like what we should and shouldn't do. And then when you do it, like, well, what do we got to do so that we're not killing each other, right? When we're breaking the web of trust, we got to do something. And so we have to restore the web of trust, right? That is, and then now we call that justice. Okay. So justice is to align, okay? Justify, align. Okay. Justice is to align things with how they should be or were before. Really, it's to make whole. That's the purpose of justice, is to realign society with its values and restore the web of trust. Some people say, no, justice is retribution. It's like, yes, one side of justice is retribution and the other side is restoration. Okay, so justice is two-pronged, meaning it has an intent based on the math over here. Okay. And that intent is to make this person whole, right? So make Steve whole is number one, and restore the web of trust, number two. Okay. That's why we form institutions. Institutions exist to deconflict and normalize society. Why? Because it is the best path forward. This is the best way to survive and promote continuity, which we can see that right now because we're like about to stop cell death, and we're creating AI and all sorts of craziness right now around like how this actually turns out to be, how it happens over time iteratively. So that's just a function of the self-organizing system of life, okay, which is don't die. All right. So that is a brief overview of how morality is both objective and subjective. When you're alone, okay, whatever is best for your survival is what is good. But when you decide to enter into agreement with other people, whether it's explicit or implicit, then your brain, in all the science and all the things, all the biology that's going on, right, all the math that's happening on the backside, is this implicit agreement. And this is why, okay, we don't allow these things. But interestingly enough, what we also need to remember is that all of those same rules apply to the institution. Okay, which is why we have revolutions, because this guy eventually, right, dies, new generation, they don't understand. They have no idea what's going on. They're just trying to operate. I don't know. My dad told me this was good, right? This is good. I got to do this thing. And look at these stupid people that just do stupid things. And we got to control them. And what we need is to do that is we need money. We need all the taxes. All right. So it's like, give me more taxes and more taxes because I need more and more control because there's so many people and we just keep adding more and more laws and more laws and more laws until eventually everybody's in prison. And they go, wait a minute. I don't know. I don't fully understand all of this, but I just know that I didn't sign up. And they go, I don't agree. And then they take the AR-15s and they shoot these people and they kill them. And then they try to start over. And that is how the United States was formed. But you can see all of these things in our current justice system. In our current justice system, we try the restorative model in the sense that we try to restore the victims, right? Using, oh gosh, I can't think of the word right now. Well, so we have community service, so that's like one version, sometimes prison, right? Rehabilitation is the idea, but they're terrible at it. We're terrible at it. But the other side is reparations. Okay. And don't think of that in terms of like slavery and those things, but think of it in terms of like, or restitution. You could call it, like, there's different words, but it's like, you gotta make them whole. I think restitution is actually the word. So you're going to pay them restitution and you're going to do your time or you're going to go on probation. And the whole idea is that it's two prongs of justice, which is one, restoration of the victim to wholeness and restoration of the public trust. Because once someone does something bad, then everybody else feels afraid. Okay. It increases the probability and awareness that those bad things can happen. And so we want to, when this is broken, we want to go, no, hold on. We'll restore it. You're safe, John and Sarah, you're safe. Don't go do something crazy because ultimately we have to keep this whole thing going. And that is the job of the institution, is to normalize. But unfortunately, sometimes it just gets out of hand because of how generational amnesia works, social amnesia. That happens. And ultimately, like I said in the last couple chapters of my book, if you want to maintain this, then you need to make the agreement explicit. And you need to stop the institution from ever becoming its own organism. The institution has an intent, which is to maintain this web of trust, keep them. So they say, safety and all that. Well, there's certain things you can't delegate, which we'll get into in another video. But since you're watching, it's personal defense and freedom of speech. The institution can never be responsible for your personal safety. And it can never be responsible for your internal thoughts. But we'll get into that in another video. Hopefully by now you understand that this is both the solution and the problem, and this needs to be made explicit. And what we need to do is identify, what is good for this and what is bad for this. And we also have to respect the autonomy of the family unit and the individuals to decide for themselves that they agree. And we cannot allow the institution to ever begin to cause the math to not work out. Because that's how you get the taxation with that representation issue, or many other issues like that are the same, and ultimately these people die, or they just wage war and then lots of people die. That's ultimately the point of the Constitution and the point of the balance of power. That was our founding fathers' best attempt to do that. Unfortunately, there just isn't enough teeth. There aren't enough teeth in the Constitution to stop this guy. And so they were like, well, we'll just give them guns, which is fine. because they need it for themselves anyway, but also they need to be able to point it at this guy if things get hairy and he starts acting out, right? Mr. Institution over here. So that is morality and ethics in a nutshell. If you don't agree to live in community, then you need to leave. You need to not benefit from community and the purpose of community in any way. Otherwise, you are violating the agreement and you are benefiting from community in a way that does not benefit or is not benefiting the purpose, the underlying purpose of community, which is survival. Okay. And so the last thing I'll say on this is that relativism takes over, like life gets good, right? We have heard that saying, like tough men create good times create soft men create hard times create good men, hard men create good times. We've all heard that. And that is a function of relativism, which happens as life gets too easy and we forget that we're animals. And we think that our technological advances mean that we've evolved when we haven't, but the technology that we use has evolved. And so that's an important distinction. And what happens is we forget. So we just forget that all this is important. And when you begin to see behaviors that do not align with the math, right? When behaviors are not good for the math of this family unit, especially when they're not like doesn't seem harmful, but when they're harmful to the culture, like, so for example, there are like some things happening today that are like this, right? Some things that, would say like, well, there's a lot of confusion, right? We don't understand. I know I don't like it, but I don't understand why, right? Sometimes, right? And many times it's because those behaviors may not seem harmful physically to you, to this particular family unit, but what they are harmful to is the culture. And when they're harmful to the culture or the zeitgeist or the way that this operates, and it doesn't align with the survival of the human species and your family unit, then we call that borrowing. Okay, you are borrowing, you are benefiting from community in ways that do not align with the core values of the community and what it was founded on. And this is like so many things, right? Greed, corporate greed, where they're stealing, right? Over taxation, all of our politicians who were really supposed to be servants, right? Servants are getting paid more money than the people who they're serving, which is ridiculous. It gives, we give them power. They think that they're special, and really they're just, well, we'll get into that in another video, but yeah, borrowing is not good. So when people behave in ways that benefit them, but don't contribute to the core value of society, it doesn't matter how good society is. When too many people borrow, some sociologists call this parasitism, right? They become parasites on the community. These are like the people who are taking advantage of welfare fraud, tax fraud, also other behaviors like, and you'll see like a lot of mental health issues like coming out of some of these things because there's a lot of dissonance in their behavior and they don't understand why. And it's all because of social amnesia, generation after generation, when you forget why the heck we're doing all this. Social amnesia and a drifting context window. You don't have the context to understand all of this, that we're animals and that we're trying to survive. So in that case, like hopefully next time you vote with the understanding of what morality is. You understand what it is we're all trying to do here. You don't confuse the advancements in technology with the evolution of the human animal. And next time you go to do something and you question whether or not it was moral or immoral, then you can ask yourself these questions. And I believe you have to, I'll put it up on the website. Here it is. And so what I'll do is I will put a link up for you guys that shows you the dual morality spectrum. This is something that I've created called the Ethereal Compass, and it gives you an understanding of like north being good behavior, right? Behaviors that promote trust and enable trade, because those are the core functions of civilization. Explicit agreements with other moral agents, like we discussed. Behavior, and on the south side, bad behaviors would be behaviors that discourage trust and harm community. And then breaking explicit agreements, which again we showed was on top of the implicit agreement. And then the east and the west, which is more of the subjective agreements, right? The personal virtues and values, what you think is right, versus like what is right according to survival and the web of trust and the implicit agreement. And your feelings towards like other animals and nature and the environment. Those things can also be subjective. They could be objective too, but they can also be subjective and mostly subjective. Historical precedents, like traditions, like, oh, this is right because we've always done it this way. And it's like, well, it is a consideration, because sometimes the breakdown of culture can be bad for civilization. But if the culture was built on top of relativism and it started veering off course because everything that a self-organizing system does is a feedback loop, then sometimes you got to break it down. You got to tear it down and rebuild it. And that's what we see. That's what all of life has been, is just the tearing down and rebuilding of, we could say it like of everything that's been DNA, built on top of DNA, created on top of DNA, grown on top of DNA. All of societies, right, when they have the wrong values, they grow, they veer off into relativism, and they die, and they have to be rebuilt, right? Rome, right? Talking about you, Rome. And then societal norms, again, culture. So culture and traditions are subjective, and they need to be weighed against this, right? They need to be weighed against this whole concept of the implicit agreement. And so here we've got, I've even got like some of these things, right? Like the fundamental moral dictate. In an environment with only one capable of judgment, the will of one becomes what's moral and good, right? When you're by yourself, whatever you think is good, because there's no one else depending on you or in agreement with you. But in an environment where there exists more than one living in community with another, then morality exists both objectively as a construct of the primal goal of community, which is survival, and subjectively as mutually agreed upon constructs defining the relationship between them, explicit agreements. In this circumstance, in addition to whatever subjective agreement two or more define, behaviors that promote trust and enable trade are objectively good, and any behavior that injures or leaves another less than whole without their prior consent is bad. Okay, it doesn't matter if it's the government, the people in the government making those decisions. It doesn't matter if it's the person next door making those decisions. Society is not built on institutions. Institutions are created as a result of community. Okay, the government is not the reason the economy exists. The government is a function of the economy, which is a function of civilization. And so this is why we have to understand how these things work, so that we can correct the systems that we have, get back to a moral way of living. And it does not mean that you have to be like religious. It means that you need to understand biology and neuroscience, and you need to understand what the heck you're doing in community. And if you don't want to be a part of it, then you need to get out. And there's nothing wrong with that. You do not have to live in community with others, but that also means that you don't get to benefit from community and all the benefits of living in civilization. And it also means that you are subject to tribalism, which means that community might kill you and take your resources. Which we saw, the United States is like one version of that, where they came over, they killed off the Indians, we took what we wanted, because ultimately that's the strongman version. So if you don't want to live in that kind of world, then you have to abide by the agreement. And if you think that morality is subjective and you can do whatever you want, then just know that if you're not the strongman, you're going to have a bad time. Right? If you're not the strongman, you're going to have a bad time. So I will drop a link to this so you can download it. I include how to properly define good and evil, what's good, what's bad, and then the pillars, pillar of covenant, the pillar of agency, primal purpose, pillar of justice. And we'll do another video on justice soon, so stay tuned for that. Guys, if you like this video, do me a favor, hit the like button. It'll improve the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be dropping more information, like more philosophy like this one. And we're going to go far and wide, hopefully, and really dig into why we are who we are, why we behave the way we behave, and what it is that we should be doing in community, and how we should think about that going forward for the sake of our children and ourselves. So with that, I appreciate you guys sticking around, and we will see you on the other side.